Hello, and welcome to Arts and Entertainment.
With Chris and Randall.
I am Chris.
I'm Randall.
And welcome to our show. As always, I always like to start the show by saying, if you already like and subscribe to our show, thank you so much. Please, if we say something over the course of today's show that you go, right on, or no, or hey, I have another question about it, please leave a comment. Randall, how can people leave comments?
I think right now the best place is like on Facebook, our Facebook page. Go to our website, chrisandrandall.com, to find out every place our show is located. You can also send us an email.
Always can. And again, if you want notifications for our latest episodes, I guess the best place to go would be either YouTube or to the website. We always post once a week, normally on Thursday. So you can always just look for us in wherever you normally look for us, whether that's we're on Twitter, we're on Spotify. What else are we on?
Yeah, but go to our website, chrisandrandall.com. The plan is to post once a week, Thursday, 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time.
All right, well, let's get down to the show. So I'm beginning to notice a trend with a lot of our shows, which is here's something that happened in our past. What was it like in that point in the past? And what is it like looking at it today in the present? And this show really goes into it in a way that we haven't been able to do before, because before we would talk about, hey, there's a movie from the 80s, or a whole bunch of movies from the 80s, or some book we read when we were a kid. But this is a weird medium because there's only one medium I can honestly say where time has truly stood still, where you get to go back in time or be in any moment in time, and the repetition of it is part of the experience. And I am talking about radio. So today's show is titled Growing Up with Radio and Growing Old with Radio. And we're going to talk about those two very, very distinct experiences of what radio was like in our early years as children, as teenagers, as guys in college. And then we're going to look at what the radio experience is like for us today in 2020. So I guess I should go first because I'm older than you, Randall, right? So basically...
well, this was your idea, Chris. This is your show.
So you asked me this question, I remember, on another show about radio, like, what was the first radio I ever got? And I distinctly remember my mom bought me a bright orange monophonic, just giant, big, fat, single speaker radio must have been 1976. And I wasn't the first time I heard radio. Obviously, I'd hear it in the car, and we would hear it, everywhere. In New York City in the 70s, you'd hear it in a taxi cab. There was no place you didn't hear radio, but there was something very powerful in the way that maybe it's almost like when you get your first computer or your first TV set, because when I was in the car with my mom and my sister, it was a democracy. So they had this equal voice, and my mom was the driver, so maybe she had a little bit more of a voice, and who was ever sitting in the front seat would have voice. But this is a radio, and I had 100% control over it. I was in my bedroom. Even though it was a portable radio, I would still listen. Even though it had batteries, I would only listen to it in my bedroom. And I felt so powerful as a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, this young kid with the ability to control music. And, TV back then only had 3 networks, 3 local stations, and a PBS station, whereas the radio had it seemed like an infinite amount of stations. But that said,
could I actually on the technology tip here, Chris?
Yeah.
So anyway, so I think it was in the 60s when the transistor radio was first introduced, and before then radios were these big hulking monsters that had vacuum tubes, and when the transistor radio came out, it became this huge thing, right? So everybody, like your first radio, all these radios suddenly became portable. People could carry them around. And, and they could be in cars, and they could be everywhere. I mean, that started in the 60s, really.
That's a very good point. Yeah, that, you're raising a good point, which is I didn't even really understand how new transistor radios were.
So what year were you born?
I was born in 65, which
Yeah,
is
so
probably
you
around the very moment.
Yeah, so you probably the first right there on the tip of the fad of the transistor radio. I mean, people today will never understand probably like how much the transistor radio probably changed. I mean, culture and civilization. I mean, that's the era of the Beatles and like the big bands and everything. And it's
And
because everybody could
also,
carry radio everywhere they went, right?
they had these transistor radios. I ended up getting them. That would be my next radio, which was, it looked, again, just like a regular radio, but here was the cool thing. There was an earpiece that you would stick. You would stick this earpiece into the radio, one earpiece only, in your ear, and ta-da! Now you could go anywhere you wanted, and you could hear music or baseball games or sports. You could be in a car, you could be in a bus, you could be among family members, and you'd have your privacy because it would just be you and the radio and the DJ or the music or whatever, and no one else. And that was the walk up prior to 1980, 1979. That was really as good as you got. Not as good as you got, but it was close to as good as a Walkman,
Yeah.
That was your
The
portal
personal
on the
radio.
world.
The personal radio. It was
AM,
only possible.
FM, transistor radio.
That's right. Amazing. People will never understand. I mean, I think people look back and like just not understand why suddenly rock music and all this popular music just took off and the culture changed. It could just because of transistor radio, maybe. I don't know.
That's a great point because in 1965, when I was born, the FCC came up with FM radio, frequency modulation radio. And there was this weird ruling where they did not want FM radio was not allowed to use AM radio's format. So
really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it wasn't until 67 that it finally went into effect. But if you were an AM stations had dominated what was called top 40. And to be really clear, in 1970s, all I would listen to is top 40 radio. Top 40 is, literally whatever the latest hits on music are. It doesn't even have to do with genre, just whoever is popular, that's top 40. So FM station started with something called freeform, where they would basically pick any kind of thing they wanted, whether it was the DJ could pick jazz and soul and rock and experimental music, and it was really up to the purview of the DJ. But by the end of the 70s, things had narrowed down to what was called album-oriented rock. And album-oriented rock we'll get to in a moment. But first, let me just talk about 1970s New York City. We had these great DJs on WNBC and WABC. We had a guy named Cousin Brucie. We had another guy who you probably heard of because he just recently passed away. Oh my God, now I can't remember him. Howard Stern's nemesis. He always talks about.
Oh yeah, Don Imus.
Don Imus, yeah, Don Imus, Cousin Brucie Morrow, Don Imus, and ABC and NBC. They were almost interchangeable. Look, I'm a young boy, and my favorite thing at this point in history was the Beatles. So, like, any station that would play the Beatles, I'd listen to, or Wings. And then, like, by the mid-'70s, when Chic and the Bee Gees came out and disco came out, I would listen to anything that had that. And in the 70s, top 40 radio was a lot of fun because as a kid, all I ever thought about that was it's grown-up people's music. It's grown-up people's music. It's either what those kids, the people who had been grown-ups today listened to when they were slightly younger, or what those cool people who were doing were going to Studio 54 and other clubs in the city. And it was my entree into the adult world. And, as a kid, you don't have a lot of money in the 70s. So your mom would give you some money. You'd go to the record store and you'd buy a 45 because you could always afford to buy a 45. And the only way you would know what to buy is by what you would listen to on the radio. And if I liked something really a lot, it was so cool to then go to this You could just walk into any record store and say, hey, that Kenny Loggins song where he says, wherever I call you friend, where is it? And the person working in the record store knew exactly what you were talking about, hand it to you. It was maybe $1 or less than $1. It was so cheap that my mom never cared. I remember albums were like a special gift. Normally my grandmother would give me those. Maybe, in a good year, I'd get 5 or 6 albums, That would be a really good year, but I could have as many 45s as I liked.
Well, let me ask you, I just have a question,
Yeah.
a little question.
Go ahead.
Was there ever anything where you heard it on the radio, you loved it, you went to the record store and they didn't know it, didn't have it? Did that ever happen?
No, because this was top 40. That was the beauty of it. It was so you could just hum a tune. Years later,
they had everything. They had everything on the radio.
Yeah, years later, like in the late 90s, I would work in a record store, and people would come up to me and do the exact same thing, and I had no clue.
I didn't know you worked at a record store.
Yeah, I worked at the warehouse in the mid 90s.
Wow, how long?
Just for about a year, and we'll get to that later. But it's interesting how much easier, because if a song was popular on the radio, you'd hear it on everywhere. You'd hear it on variety hour shows. It would be played over and over. And people worked in record stores. There were a lot, I don't know, they just really knew their music. And
but not you.
Well, no, I was a kid. My girlfriend asked me this question, and I said, yeah, sometimes I had a tape recorder not too soon after I had the radio. And sometimes I would just literally on a cassette tape record the song off the radio so I could have it. Did you ever do that?
Yeah, I just want to say, yes, I did do that. I just want to say that at least when I was a kid, all the time I can remember, they used to make these radios that had like a cassette tape deck built in. And it was well known that one of the things you do with it was just record stuff off the radio. I mean,
oh yeah,
I knew a guy in college. He was a musician. He loved music. He had bootlegs of everything. He was constantly recording. He had a huge collection of just cassette tapes of stuff he recorded. He would always, when a new kid moved in, he was the resident. What did they call it? Resident advisor of the dorm.
Yeah, RA.
Whenever a new kid moved in, he would like want to look at their music collection and then want to record stuff out of it. And so he had this huge bootleg collection.
I did it as well, all through. I mean, I would continue to record the radio from, say, the age of 7 right to the age of 22.
This is what we did before Napster.
Right through college. It still seemed like getting free music.
Right.
So you're 10 years younger than me. So if I'm describing mid-70s, early 80s New York City as a child, beginning of disco, top 40 radio. I loved disco back then and top 40. Let's fast forward. So for you, what have been, early 80s? Was this when you were living in Hawaii or San Bernardino? Listening to the radio for the first time.
I left Hawaii when I was 8 or 9, so I don't have any memories of the radio there. I think we were talking about this like in one of our pre-conversations, though. The world we grew up in, Chris, right? There were like speakers everywhere, right? There was like there used to be this term called elevator music. I haven't heard anybody literally use that term in 10 years.
And to explain to the viewers, elevator music isn't radio music. It's this very weird electronic reinterpretation of popular songs.
Right. It was like you would take like a popular song and then you'd rewrite it and remake it so that it didn't have lyrics and it was slower and it was gentler and it was more boring.
It was this very robot instrumentation of a song. It would always take you a good 10 seconds to a minute to recognize the song because A, there was no singing. B, the instrumentation was so awkward. It's as if like robots decided that they liked music too.
Well, it was supposed to be boring. That's the thing. It was supposed to be boring. But I just wanted to say about that. That elevator music, music used to be everywhere. I don't know if it was because suddenly the technology allowed people to put speakers and radios everywhere, and recorded music everywhere. But for some reason,
I think you're right. Yeah, no, you're right. Like supermarkets.
It was a fad. It was a trend. It was like everywhere you went, music was playing everywhere. everywhere.
I think
Even
you
in the
still,
elevator. That was the weird thing. You'd get
yeah.
into an elevator, and I don't think it happens anymore. It's so bizarre. I
Well,
mean,
elevators now have TVs for you to watch, but
sometimes.
pretty much everywhere still to this day has music piped in.
You think so? Because I don't know. I don't
I
know.
know
My
so.
grocery store doesn't have it anymore.
Well, then you must go to an independent grocery, because if you go to any of the
It's Vaughn's
Kroger,
Pavilions. It's Pavilions.
well, what are they up to? Because my Vaughns, they play
Trader Joe's?
music.
I don't think they do it.
Oh, hell yeah, you need to
Really?
listen. Oh
I'm
yeah,
gonna have to
check it
listen.
out.
I don't know.
You check it out. All the supermarkets still do it. My girlfriend's roof in her building plays music. We can get
The
to that
roof?
later on. Yeah.
Is there a DJ? Is there a roof DJ?
I don't know, but we'll hit the modern era soon. I promise, folks.
But
That's
yeah,
the
I don't
part
have many.
two.
You asked. I don't have many memories of music in
So when
Hawaii.
did
I know
you,
that the local radio stations were big there.
So when you got to San Bernardino, when did you get your? When did you hear the radio in the car with your mom and your siblings?
Yes, of course. My mother, she loved playing music on the radio. My mother liked listening to new music. She didn't like
Really?
oldies. Yes, my mother always listened to new music. My mother's taste in media was almost exactly the same as Howard Stern's.
Wait, okay, that's so weird. I met your mom, lovely woman. No knocking her at all, but when you meet someone's mom at this day and age, you don't think of them as a young person. So, like, take me back, 1981, 1980, early 80s.
Early 80s. In Hawaii, let me tell you something. In Hawaii, I have very early memories of my mother recording music off the radio.
Really?
Like, I after we moved, I mean, she was still kind of young, I guess, then. But yeah, I mean, she was the same thing as we would have done as kids. She liked something on the radio. She wanted to get a recording of it. Yeah, but.
So what did your mom? I'll tell you some songs my mom liked in a minute. But what songs did your mom like to listen to in the car? You got, okay, I got to listen to my mom hear this song.
Nah, you know what? My mother, she really liked Sinead O'Connor. I remember.
Oh, your mom's really cool.
My mother liked new music. Okay, she didn't like listening to the old. Like, if I ever tried to turn on oldies stations, my mother would say, "I've already heard those songs a million times," and she wanted to listen to new music.
My mom was the opposite to this day. No, my mom loves songs from the 50s, loves them. When I was a teenager, we used to play Bill Haley and the Comets and Elvis Presley.
Yeah, my mother had no nostalgia. She doesn't like reruns. She doesn't like any of that stuff. She likes new stuff. She likes novelty.
That's awesome. My mom listens to like the Beatles channel now. I got her Sirius years ago, and she'll listen to all of that. And it's weird too, because I think it's really important to point this out. In the 70s, there was what I would call grown-up music on the radio. And there was a station, I think it was called WOR, and they had one of the most famous hosts, a guy named William B. Williams, who had been a big DJ in the New York jazz scene from like the 40s up till now. And you get in a cab and some middle-aged guy in his 40s, like around your age or as old as mine, and all you'd hear coming out of that radio was like Sinatra, Tony Bennett,
I love that music in high school, by the way. I was in marching band, and all the marching band geeks, we all love big band music, man, of course,
I mean, that was it. Like in the 70s, radio for adults was either classical music or it was like, Bing Crosby or Sinatra or...
Can I just tell a little marching band story that's relevant?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
okay, so when I was in marching band, we went to a giant field show competition. My marching band, we went to a giant field. Field shows are the little shows that marching bands do on a football field in halftime.
Yeah.
And there was this big competition we went to in San Diego. There were like dozens and dozens of other marching bands from all over the country there, and we're all staying in the hotel. And one day, I get into the elevator, and there's this guy with a boombox. People used to carry around boomboxes, like, which is like
80s, so 80s. It's basically double speakers, cassette tape, and a radio on the top.
It's basically like a giant transistor radio with giant speakers. You carry it around, and you play it really loud, so you can irritate everybody. And
did you put it over your shoulder?
Right. Did you like it's so huge?
Boom, 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 boom.
And then it has a tape deck usually. But okay, so I get on the elevator. Okay, this is the only time in my life this ever happened. This guy, he's a band geek. In the elevator, he's blasting like Frank Sinatra or something like that. He's blasting big band music, like like Tommy Dorsey Orchestra or something. Right.
Love me a lady delight. I did it
Only
my way. Boom, boom, boom.
I've never seen that before in my life. But yeah, it was a pretty wild scene down there, man.
I mean, that's a good high school. So okay, let's get to high school and middle school. Certainly a really big seminal experience for me is I'm 13 years old. It's the beginning of the school year. I missed the first 3 weeks of that year because I was in the hospital. I had to have a kidney operation. It wasn't an emergency procedure. I was born with what they call a horseshoe kidney, and it was discovered that I had my left kidney was 3 times the size of my right kidney. There was an obstruction. They had to go.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they had to go and remove the excess muscle and fix the blockage. And in 1979, you were in the hospital for a long time. That procedure it took me about 3 weeks in the hospital to recover. And, there's a TV, but I'll be honest with you, you're a kid. There's just only so many soap operas and game shows you can watch in the daytime, I mean, it just doesn't work. I mean, afternoon, you got your shows. Evening, you got your shows. But the days, man, I guess my mom must have brought me a radio. She totally did. And I have zero image of what this radio looked like. But, oh, my God, I would just live to listen to. Now, at this point, 81, I'm listening to FM radio. And FM radio is so much cooler because now FM radio is playing songs that one station would play Led Zepplin, but another station would play Elvis Costello. And sometimes it would play like a really big hit, and sometimes there's some obscure stuff. I remember around the same month that I am in the hospital, the single from Pink Floyd's The Wall, Another Brick in the Wall, Part 1, comes out. And no, I'm sorry, it's Comfortably Numb. Single comes out for that. And I'm in the hospital, and the opening lyrics are, okay, it's just another pinprick. You will feel, but you may feel a little sick. And here I am, literally getting pinpricked. My right arm is like a pincushion because I'm in so much pain. And I'm
Pink
listening.
Floyd was talking to you, Chris.
They were like, hardcore. You could not have found a more appropriate song to there is no pain you are receiving. And of course, I was in terrible pain, but I was also getting high on 1979 high grade. What did they give? What is in that thing?
Oh my gosh, you got the good stuff. Holy crap.
Oh yeah, I was flying. So I'm tripping.
How old were you again?
13-year-old Chris Corbell lying in the hospital tripping to Pink Floyd on the radio.
Oh my God.
And I definitely
sounds like the greatest thing ever.
I had that little earpiece in it, so the person I was sharing the room wouldn't be, wouldn't have to worry about the sound. And and it was so
a little
cool
personal opium
because, well, it was 13, and now I'm beginning to realize that the music in the world is there to talk, is like poetry. It's like, hey, you're a human being. We write songs about being a human being. You're not alone. This is a shared experience. And we're going to go through this. And I would listen to the DJs, and they weren't like, Cousin Brucie and Don Imus. They have these voices. They talk like little Ingram, all right. Coming up next, Captain, it's a deal. Hello. We'll keep them together. Boom, boom. They were like, hey, this is Dave Herman. This is Vin Scelsa. And coming up next is another deep cut off Fleetwood Mac's. Well, yeah, Rumors are, it was a deep cut at the time. No, it wasn't. That's the wrong album to pick on. But they would play no, because there's no such thing as a deep cut on Rumors. It doesn't exist. But they're like, here's a new band that we really think is going to go somewhere. They're called U2. And, or here's a band, The Police. Actually, 1979, if you were a cool DJ, you'd be playing the second album, Regatta de Blanc. Coming up next, Walking on the Moon. And at the same time, there were these things called do you remember the King Biscuit Flower Hour?
No.
So on the Westwood One radio network, which is hysterical because it was founded now where I live, they had the King Biscuit Flower Hour, and it was on the weekends. and it'd be an entire concert by an artist. So Joe Jackson had just broken, and I remember just lying in bed, sick as a dog, just recovering, listening to an entire concert on radio. It must have been over an hour long with commercials, but still, just one artist live recording. And you close your eyes as a kid. And, 13, I hadn't really been to that many concerts.
And you're high on opiates.
And I'm high on opiates, and I'm in pain. And it was transcendent. You know what I'm saying? Transcendent.
I know. How long were you in there?
3 weeks. But this was and also, this is the last point I want to make, because I really feel like this is the last I can say that the middle school experience is on Sunday night. There was this guy, I can't remember which station, but his name was Dr. Demento. And this, I'm 13 years old going on 14. And if you were a boy or a girl, it's like the most perfect DJ for any adolescent. If you were like between the ages of 12 and 14, Dr. Demento is your god, because all Dr. Demento would play for an hour and a half were novelty comedy songs. And some of them were just that. There was like this song called Fish Heads, and it was absurd, You know that song?
Well, MTV started playing it a lot too, because of Dr. Demento.
Right.
I think Dr. Demento got a show on MTV briefly.
Right. So Fish Heads, okay. Some of those songs were great. But again, I swear to God, while I'm in the hospital, this young 19-year-old kid out of Van Nuys, California, had just made fun of what was the most popular, ubiquitous, and good hip song of that summer, which I had just heard ad nauseum, which was, what was it now? It was the Knack song. My Sharona?
My Sharona, right.
Was that his first hit, right?
Sharona, I don't know. You go on.
No, it wasn't My Sharona. Somebody's going to say, hey, man, you don't really remember what the first... yeah, well, I would have had an awesome intro, wouldn't I, if I'd done my freaking research? Yeah, whatever the first Weird Al Yankovic song was.
And that young man was Weird Al Yankovic.
Yeah, that man. And was that another one, Rides the Bus?
Oh, yes, I remember that song. Yes. I don't know if it was the first one, but Demento broke him, though. Demento
broke him. And because Demento broke him, and it was a song that I no longer in my 54-year-old brain can remember, comment below with the name of that song, please.
Well, I thought
it was, go ahead.
I want to say that, Dr. Demento breaking Weird Al, I mean, that wasn't unusual for the era. I mean, it used to be there were these radio DJs who were just guys that sat on the radio, broadcasting live, and they would just listen to new music, and if they liked it, they'd play it, and people used to send them cuts. People used to send them music, right? And if the DJ liked it, he'd play it, right? And
well, it's a weird
that's
deal,
how it used to work, right?
Actually, what was going on at the time was Payola.
Oh yeah, of course. There's the Payola thing, but
when I was listening to Pink Floyd The Wall, what had happened was the first week the album came out, it didn't even crack the Billboard Top 50, and then they ended up paying Payola, and all these radio stations that I was listening to, they started to play it. Now, did that mean that particular DJ was playing that song because his boss said so, or because that DJ was being paid to do so? I can't say. I really don't know. I will say that, yeah, it was definitely happening. And knowing that today as an adult, there's a great, I recommend this book called Hitmen, which is about rock and pop music from the 50s right through the beginning of the 20th century. It looks at people like Clive Davis, and it shows you how popular music used unethical ways to make music big. So yeah,
right.
Sure.
Can I just say here,
what was cool about? Let me just get back to Weird Al for a sec. So what was really cool about Weird Al, and I got to thank you, Dr. Demento, because I don't believe anyone paid you to play this 19-year-old kid's song that he mailed to you. I was right. It was a parody of the number one song of the summer, My Sharona. It was called My Bologna. The guys from the Knack were also from the Valley, also around the same age, also had broken pretty much as a brand new young band, the answer to the Beatles, kind of new wave. They were a bunch of guys themselves, straight out of, I want to say Chatsworth, but right near, for those of you, let me do it this way. The real Knack grew up about less than 30 minutes from Weird Al. They lived in the exact same world, and they were being pumped as new music. And I freaking loved My Sharona. And I think actually I could talk about that in a moment too, but I'm going to give that over to you before we get to My Sharona. But Weird Al was literally taking the same rhythm and beats, you know, do 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 do, and all he was doing was just changing the lyrics, just like when you were a kid. Did you ever take the song Jingle Bells and do it like, you know, Batman smells, Robin laid an egg?
Did I? Yes.
Yeah.
Well,
So
it's a parody. It's a parody song.
Right. But it was like the first time I ever heard such a slick parody song. And you and I both have this infatuation with comedy. And man, that really made me think hard and long. So I would listen to Demento for a few more years. But I think going into high school, really the big takeaway for me is that radio in that point was definitely my key to what is cool, what is interesting, what is hip, what I should be listening to, and not what's going on. Like, I really learned from that experience that radio was my domain. You know what I'm saying? Like TV, movies, that was for grown-ups. Books, Jesus, that was for really old people. But radio, man, radio was for me at 13, me at 20, you know, like it was going to get me over that hump. Do you have like some kind of experience in that?
Well, I remember going to college. Well,
prior to college, yeah.
In high school, I loved listening to oldie stations. I mean, well, in San Bernardino, there were pretty much only two good stations to listen to.
What were the two good stations?
It was like, oh God, I can't remember the rock station. There was one rock, KCAL. There was one rock station in San Bernardino. It's called KCAL. There were a couple of country music stations. Actually, when I was really young, I was listening to a country music station in San Bernardino, and it was good, right? Because they played like super old stuff, right? I'm talking about like Grand Ole Opry type stuff, and I really liked it, right? But then they switched over to contemporary, you know, modern country, new country, and it was like I didn't like it. And then there was an oldies station, you know, they played like 50s, 60s rock. I really liked that. I mean, 50s rock I loved, you know, like Phil Spector type era. And then, I went off to college and.
Hold on for college, because I want to hit college in a moment. But in high school, it was not really for you about the new music. It was more about.
Well, I loved. Catalog. See, I was into. When Nirvana, I didn't really like. Most of my youth, it was all about hair bands. It was like heavy metal. It was like
it's the early 90s,
Priest.
Right?
Yeah, it was like the begin. You know, it was when MTV was going through its hair band phase.
So you were in high school from like 90 to 94?
Well, I started high school like in the late 80s.
Okay.
Graduated, 91 or something? Anyway.
Okay, so right.
93. I think I graduated in 93. Was that college? I think I might graduate in college in 93. No, that was high school. Graduated college in 97. But the 80s was all about hair bands, you know, on MTV. Like I'd come home from school, turn on MTV, it'd just be all hair bands, like Poison and stuff like that. Poison, Guns N' Roses, you know, I mean, and that stuff was all right. But I didn't like it that much.
Yeah. So you were listening to radio almost.
So I was turning on the oldie station in San Bernardino. KCAL was playing like all the hair bands. I didn't like that stuff very much.
Yeah.
And so I was listening to like, you know, music from the 40s, 50s, and 60s, you know, I think it was mostly from the 40s and 50s, actually. It was, God, what was the station? I can't remember. It's still there, I think. It was an oldie station, San Bernardino. All they played was that, and I loved it. And I just love listening to that music from that era, you know. And
do you remember the DJs at all? Any of their names?
There were no DJs. I mean, it was just like they just play the music. You know, the funny thing is like, I guess that music, that was originally the music for people our age, you know, if people my age in high school, you know, but from 20, 30 years back, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, no, I mean, and so did any of your friends also listen to those radio stations, or was that just you? Were you the only person you knew in your own age group?
There were other people that would only listen to the oldie station. I remember talking to a very young substitute teacher that was very cute, but she told me she also only listened to the oldie station. I remember that conversation.
And maybe when you were in band, did any of your bandmates or band teachers listen to that station?
You know, like I told you before, there were a lot of band geeks who were all into big band music. I got into big band music. I had a Frank Sinatra album or two, like Frank Sinatra Greatest Hits, I think I had. It was awesome. I listened to that over and over. It was a very good year, you know.
Yeah. When you were 17.
When I was 17. Yeah.
And when I was 17, it was a very good year. It was 1983. See how well I seamlessly segued. And high school was a very weird time in radio for me, because in the 80s, prior to MTV, well, first off, by the time I got to high school, I disavowed my interest in disco for a bit. I just did. I just totally disavowed my interest in disco. And I was definitely listening to something that I listened to a lot of Steely Dan, which you absolutely heard on a lot of radio, but it took me off in the route of progressive jazz, which you did hear a lot of on the radio. So what was happening in New York in the early 80s was they were finally deciding that you couldn't play Elvis Costello and Jethro Tull on the same station. So now we were getting a division between rock, like Led Zeppelin, Heart, The Doors, and then like there's a station out of Long Island called WDRE, and they were basically ripped off LA's K-Rock, and they would play the new wavy stuff. And this is prior to MTV. When MTV breaks, you end up having basically three kinds of stations. The ones that just play rock and roll, Led Zeppelin, The Doors, Aerosmith. And then you had stations that would just, play like Depeche Mode and the Hoodoo Gurus. There's a band you never hear of anymore, or the Smithereens. Hardcore, real new wave bands. And then there was the stations that were basically ripping off the MTV format, which is like, oh yeah, we'll play Whitney Houston, Duran Duran, and the Police. That synchronicity stuff. So
Pop
by the
music.
time, poppy-ish rock. So all of a sudden, I'm now going to a boarding school 90 minutes away, just out in upstate New York. We call everything upstate, but in the Hudson Valley. And I'm living in a dorm room, mostly by myself. I lucked out. I'm 17. And I start like moving around the dial to find something to listen to. And next door to me in Dutchess County is Vassar College. And it's WVKR, Vassar College Radio. And that was my beginning exposure in high school to what I call alternative radio. And unlike even MTV, they would play stuff from like England I had never heard of, or independent labels coming out of like the Lower East Side of Manhattan or Minneapolis. I would hear bands like Husker Du, and it's hard to believe Husker Du was ever obscure, but yeah, they were. Or I'd hear like Robin Hitchcock, or people you'll never hear from again. But I was hearing like Joe Boxers. Anyway, I was hearing some stuff that I would hear pretty quickly thereafter on MTV, but other stuff, and it just became so like, I was a new wave punk kid. I mean, I still loved my Steely Dan, I still loved jazz, but once again, around 17, all of a sudden, between that and in New York, WDRE, which was a complete rip-off of K-Rock, which we'll get to in a moment, with you, it was like, man, I'm not going to be a rockhead. I'm not going to be one of those guys walking around with a Rolling Stones t-shirt. That's fucking boomer music. I'm going to be walking around with, my Tonserton shirt, something very similar to this, and 10X in my hair. And I'm going to be listening to like Blancmange, And hey, I listened to it before it got on MTV because I was listening to it on College Rock. So,
well, could I just
so I'm going to ask you about in a sec. So getting into college in the 80s, I had already chosen my side. And so what was your question?
No, I just want to say something. Yeah, college radio used to be a major force in music. Like it was a smaller audience, a smaller market, but like I think the band that comes to my mind is REM,
Oh
which
yeah,
is like I
absolutely.
think the biggest band to
Perfect.
ever get broken and come out of college radio.
And I will tell you, as a college, actually, I'm gonna hold off on that. But yeah, as a college DJ, and I was a DJ in college. That was like the first thing you always play. Whenever you get, if my college, I had to start out with a classical music channel. But the minute I could do a show, we did a weird format. My buddy Dave Bishop and I was called Roots, Rap, and Reggae. And Dave, if you were out there, hi. We made it slightly different. The first 15 minutes was straight up reggae, or 20 minutes. And then I didn't want to hear any more freaking reggae. So we'd either play rap music, which was basically Fat Boys and Run DMC, or quote unquote new wave music, which was now being called alternative. And I guarantee you, even at this point where REM was just about to become go from playing college campuses and clubs to stadiums, everybody always would play something off that first album. Oh, here's a deep cut off of Murmur, Gardening While Night. Gardening at Night, which is off of the ep23 EP. So did you listen to K-Rock when you were coming up?
Yes.
K-Rock
Well, I went to USC and I didn't really have access to K-Rock till I went there. And I'd always heard, living in San Bernardino, an hour away from LA. Yeah, I've always heard stories about K-Rock, heard about Loveline. And so, yeah, when I finally get to USC, everybody's listening to K-Rock at USC. I could walk down the dorm, everybody's studying and has K-Rock on. Basically, I can walk down the hall in the dorm and I just hear K-Rock coming out of everybody's dorm room. I mean, that's how it used to be. And then Loveline, of course, everybody loved listening to Loveline.
With Dr. Drew?
Dr. Drew, Poor Man Trenton started it, and then they had to fire him for whatever reason, and then they brought in all these other people. Adam Carolla was hilarious on Loveline.
Oh my God, early Adam Carolla.
Adam Carolla was probably, I heard Ricky Rackman, Adam Carolla, I think some other guy, but Adam Carolla was probably my favorite. I wasn't really around for Poor Man, but I think Adam Carolla was probably my favorite out of the all the people I heard on Loveline. Adam Carolla was very cynical.
I used to listen to him, yeah.
He was very cynical. He didn't take any of these people seriously. I mean, it was hilarious. I mean, if you did like the greatest Adam Carolla Loveline hits from back in the radio days, I mean, it would be amazing.
I mean, and that's the other thing about radio. It wasn't just the radio; it was the DJs and the personalities, and it was really cool getting to be on the other side of that, to have people request songs. Funny quick aside, a friend of mine was hanging out in the station one night, and it was her show, and she had Attack of the Killer Bees, and there was a Depeche Mode song on it, and I had to go for some reason, but man, could you just play that song? And I left, and she and her friend were really worried as DJs whether it was responsible to play this song, because the Depeche Mode song was called I Don't Want to Live Anymore, or Sometimes I Don't Want to Live Anymore. And honest to God, I was just a hardcore Depeche Mode fan, and I had never heard it, and I just wanted to hear it. That's why I was so insistent. But she was really worried I was going to try to kill myself. Patty, if you're out there, as you know, I continue to live to tell the tale. I guess this is my shout-out show. Sorry. But, that was the thing. I've always thought to myself, because there were a few people who left that college who would go on to be DJs. I know for a fact, for where you went to college, has produced probably a ton of professional disc jockeys.
I have no knowledge.
USC, yeah, it's produced a ton. Because USC is a very, being a DJ at my small Midwestern college, we had a giant broadcast frequency because there weren't a lot of radio stations. So we went out pretty far. But at SC, did you listen to the college radio at SC?
I even knew somebody that DJ'd there for a while. You know what? I feel like at SC, when I was there, at least, nobody listened to the radio at SC, at the college radio station, because, I think a lot of these college radio stations were big because a lot of these colleges are out in the middle of nowhere. There's a lot of students. They have nothing to listen to because it's all it's all stuff for old people, or something. And the college radio stations, they had they were the only ones for that market, right? But when you went to USC, there were all sorts of stations. I mean, you had K-Rock, you had KLOS, which was playing top 40. You had
KLOS was not playing top 40. No, you're confusing KOLS with the other stations. KOLS.
Oh, there was Kiss.
Kiss. You're thinking of
Maybe
Kiss.
I'm thinking of Kiss.
Yeah, KOLS and KRQ are, I would argue, two of the most important radio stations in the West Coast, and definitely two of the most important radio stations in America. WNEW is one of the most important radio stations in New York. I think WKTU is also one of the most important radio stations, albeit that's for disco format. But the thing that's really great about KOLS was its commitment to playing rock that was new, and at the same time playing rock that was old. KOLS really was is still one of the rock stations that has its foot in both worlds. KROQ had Rodney Bingenheimer. Did you ever listen to Rodney on the Rock?
Yeah, of course. So Rodney on the Rock is like one of the oldest DJs of all time in the industry. I mean, he broke David Bowie.
You can still see him at Cantor's. He has his own corner of the deli.
He broke David Bowie in the United States. He brought David Bowie over here. He was the first one to play David Bowie in the United States. I mean, he broke tons of bands. You'd listen to Rodney, his show, and he just played new music constantly. I mean, it was just amazing. You know, if you were a band, if you started a band in your garage, a week later you'd be sending a tape off to Rodney. If you liked it, he'd play it. I mean, the guy is amazing. You know.
We had a show on DRE called Off the Boat. And I'm guarantee you it was someone robbing Rodney Bingenheimer, because one of the great things that Rodney Bingenheimer did wasn't just find new talent, but his ability prior to MTV and even during MTV to bring music from England and Europe into America, stuff you would have never heard of because they didn't have an American label. You know, there were times where you go into a record store, normally an independent record store, and you'd have to buy an import album because there was just no American distribution.
Well, I want to say also about Los Angeles, you know, Rodney was well situated because Los Angeles had some of the most amazing record stores of all time. I mean, the Tower Records on Sunset was legendary. I mean, you could go to these record stores and just, you know, there's music from all over the world in a lot of these stores. I remember the Virgin Records on Sunset. That didn't go back as far as the Tower on Sunset, but the Virgin Records on Sunset, I mean, they had an international section. I remember back in the day that was just like aisles, you know.
Here in the Westwood Village, there was another tower. It took up half a city block, and it just had floors and floors. I remember trying to interview for that job, and I had to be interviewed. They literally like, what music do you like? Do you know these terms? You know, what would you say to somebody who likes this kind? You would go into a record store during the CD period, and they would actually have demo CDs you could listen to. But people like Rodney Bingenheimer, and the guys over in New York who are at WDRE and KROQ, almost all of them, they were all putting in music that you were not going to hear on MTV until, well, you might hear it on 120 Minutes. You know, Matt Pinfield, a friend of mine, Matt Pinfield was the host of 120 Minutes. A friend of mine was a college radio DJ with him at Rutgers back in the early 80s. And that's how so many of these people who we listen to today, that's why I talk about it, they all started out as college DJs. And they love, you know, I got into this weird thing over the last several years, both on LinkedIn and in just where I would just write to DJs. I used to do radio in another life for another thing. I've done some radio as a public speaker. So I started reaching out to different DJs on LinkedIn. And if I found out that they had been on a station that I had listened to back in the day, I'd say, hey, man, I think I used to listen to you in New York, or I listened to you when I was living in Wisconsin or New Jersey or wherever it was. And I really did. And I get into conversations, and DJs are really, in my opinion, what makes the radio experience unique. You know what I'm saying? Like without a good DJ, listening to the radio is just like flipping through your own albums or just walking in a record store.
Yeah.
And,
can I say something about that, Chris?
By all means. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think is starting to really. This is something I've noticed in the internet era. The whole idea of curation is starting to disappear, and I think that's what DJs used to do. The idea of curation is exactly what you're talking about, right? So, it's somebody's job, not an artist. Somebody's job to look at all the art and say, "Oh, this is the good art. This is the bad art," right?
Well, yeah, and in the DJ perspective, I mean, yeah, a college DJ has always normally had the freedom. Some colleges like SC, I think, actually have program managers, but a DJ in a rock station in our youth normally what I did my research, they would be allowed to pick in the daytime selected cuts off of an album. Didn't have to be a hit yet, but it might be something that they were thinking about releasing as another hit. And then at nighttime, on the weekends, and the odd hours, they could do what we used to call the deep cut, where there'd be like Unga Munga, or just, Ingata Devita, just these very strange experimental songs. Because even the radio that we liked was still a commercial medium. It was still about that.
Right.
So
I just want to say, in the age of the internet, it seems like in the age of the internet that the idea is you just throw all the art in front of the audience.
Well, we're going to get to that sticks in part 2, called Where It Is Today. But just focusing on the past for the time being, it was definitely more. I would say that DJs had more say than they do now, but DJs always had been a servant of two masters, is literally what I'm trying to say, or 3, right? A DJ on one hand is always trying to play the music to develop a rapport with the listeners, but on the other hand, they make their living on ratings, because ratings is what sells ads. And one of the interesting things that came from these conversations, and I still have them, I'm friends with people who are in some of the major radio stations in America, is their jobs are so tenuous. If they go down if they go down in the rating a little bit, they move. If the station changes format, they move. If they go up in the rating, they move to a new market. But it's weird to think that DJs are like gypsies,
Yeah, I want to say that I've heard radio DJs talk about like their careers on the radio before, on their shows, and they'll say that like it's typical for a radio DJ to be fired over and over and over in their career, like 5 times, 10 times, a dozen times. I mean,
well, the best example of that is Howard Stern. I was not a big Howard Stern fan back in the WNBC era. I did see him on Letterman, but when he was coming up on WNBC, I was already done with Top 40 radio. And I don't even really think I got back into Howard until I was living in New Jersey and going to grad school. And I was dating a girl, and she used to play Howard Stern on the radio. And I had a next door neighbor who was obsessed with the TV stuff he did on PIX. So I guess really, weirdly enough, once I get out of college or grad school, I start getting a little bit more into the talk radio. Howard was still on WXRK, which did play music, and he was obnoxious as hell because sometimes he would continue to stay on past his time. But did you listen to Howard Stern back in the 90s when he was terrestrial?
Yeah, I started listening to Howard on the radio in college. I mean, lots of kids did. He was great. I loved him. I even had a professor that was a big fan.
Really? Yeah.
A female professor.
Well, hell, I remember when he came to L.A., Westwood, to sign books at Borders. I remember standing outside and watching him just to see what the man looked like in real life. Howard Stern he'd play music a little bit and talk over it, but primarily he was not a music DJ. He by the time, at least he started out as a music DJ, obviously, but by the time you got to the 80s and 90s, he was just a DJ of his own. He was the show.
Can I just say a couple things about Howard Stern?
Please.
Yeah. So one thing that's really important about Howard Stern, I think, is that he's one of the rare people in entertainment who's an innovator. Like, I remember listening to Howard Stern's show, and then like that week I would see he would do bits. Howard Stern would do comedy bits or whatever, and that week I would see his bits redone, like on like Jay Leno or something, but watered down, for a mass audience, because Howard Stern was always trying to push the envelope. But yeah, Howard Stern would do bits and jokes all the time and gags, and everybody would steal from him. Everybody.
And I liked about Howard, go ahead, I'm sorry.
And the other thing I wanted to say was Howard Stern pioneered, maybe not pioneered, but maybe he did. It was a format called drive time radio. It was basically, the idea is everybody's got a radio in their car and they're driving to work, driving home from work, and they want to listen to something, to fill that time.
Well, drive time radio started independent of Howard Stern, but he was definitely he was the biggest star of drive time radio. He put drive time radio in he basically took the industry, which was at one level, and he showed people you could take it to a level no one could have imagined. And I would say part of that also has to do with the fact that he was two things. He was a great interviewer. He would really ask, I mean, sometimes he asked the most bullshit questions about sex and farting. And sometimes he would get too juvenile. But the thing that I liked about the best Howard Sterns is when he was talking about what was going on in his life, his ability to be honest, to be vulnerable, to talk about the problems about being a father, his marriage, his health, his parents. Then he'd have these family members on. He'd talk to them, or he'd talk to somebody like Dave Letterman, and he would just, same as he was on the TV show, would be the same as he would be interviewing him on the radio or anyone. He would just say, "Why do you marry so many women?" I can't remember which person he interviewed, but like, you do. Or he said, Jerry Seinfeld, I have a theory about,
That's hilarious.
He said at Jerry Seinfeld, I have a theory about, like a lot of comics who were an ugly guy in high school, and now that you're famous, you have to make up for lost time by dating a lot of pretty women. And now it was blowing, mind-blowing. First off, he owned it, and he said that was his, before he met his wife, Allison, that was where he was at. But he was willing to say the things that people would never say. He was very honest, very vulnerable, very up forward. There's a lot about Howard Stern I was not keen on. And I think at some point I finally did grow tired of his shtick. But man, I pretty much listened to Stern all the way until he left terrestrial radio.
What didn't you like about him?
Oh, sometimes there's only so much farts and so much sex. And then then you realize his politics is a little bit more Republican than I feel comfortable with. But it was still fun.
Well, I'll just say something really interesting about that. After 9/11 happened, I was listening to a lot of people on the radio, people on talk radio, talk radio personalities, so like on KFI, AM KFI, for instance. And after 9/11 happened, there was a huge purge. Anybody who spoke out against war was pretty much fired. And I mean, I think there was an immensely talented radio guy on KFI called Phil Hendry, who's one of the funniest goddamn people ever on the face of the planet. I mean, this guy's show was amazing. I still go to YouTube and listen to his show. I mean, this guy's amazing, but immensely talented. But he admitted years later that he spoke out again. I was listening to his show. He spoke out against the war, going to war after 9/11, and he got fired for it. Point blank. Howard Stern supported going to war. So and I think all those people going to war.
I was listening to Howard Stern on 9/11. I actually listened to him. He made a joke about the plane hitting and how, because at the time we just thought it was very small potatoes. And I listened to him during that entire couple weeks thereafter. I tried listening to NPR, which was becoming more my go-to, but it was too depressing. But to hear Gary not being able to get into the city because the bridges were closed, to hear the pain that he and his whole morning crew were going from, really actually was very helpful in getting through the trauma of 9/11 in the same way you're seeing today, because he was experiencing it. And he put the jingoism aside. It's really easy to go down that road. But at least during that first several weeks, especially because he was broadcasting right from the epicenter, he lived in the same neighborhood as my mom. He was living in Manhattan. I was living in LA, but every time I had to check in with New York City, I was checking in with him. It made it, I could connect and relate. And honestly, I don't know, man. I think what we're going to end up doing is, we're coming down to the end of part one of our two-part. So, we're going to go forward into the present day in our next installment. But for me, I honestly would say after 9/11, listening to the radio is more of a passive thing for me. And for a couple of years, it's more about listening to National Public Radio. Not that I didn't listen to music, but I'm now at that point, I'm in my 30s, going to my 40s, getting into my 50s. And, we're now in a different era. So how about you? What's your last memory from that period of your life, that early aughts and radio?
Like the golden age of listening to radio for me?
Yeah. What really is the end of it for you? What brings it to a culmination?
I remember Adam Carolla quitting Loveline and moving on, right, to better things.
Oh, man. How did that feel?
I thought, okay, great. I guess they'll get somebody else hilarious on Loveline, right? And
did he quit to replace Stern? Was that when that happened?
There was I can't totally remember, but there was a lot of transition going on and a lot of radio, a lot of people's lives at the time.
Because Carolla was brought in to replace when Stern. This is funny that we're actually dovetailing, because when Stern in the early 2000s goes to Sirius in New York, he's replaced with David Lee Roth, and then on the West Coast, he's replaced by Adam Carolla.
I remember listening to David Lee Roth a little bit. It was horrible.
And then, so basically they fired Roth, and then Carolla just became the guy who held the WXRK spot. That was
did Carolla replace Stern for a while?
He totally did. He was considered the guy to replace. So I'm pretty sure.
I think I remember.
My memory, yeah.
I think I remember listening to some of those shows, and that was terrible. I mean, Adam Carolla on Loveline was like one of the greatest things that's ever happened in the history of humanity.
All right, and then you and I were friends at this time. And the buses would even say, Adam Carolla, American genius. Remember? That's how they were promoting him, like he was this new social poet bringing truth to America.
Well, it was sad because his style just didn't suit a morning drive show at all. And it was terrible. I mean, it was sad.
Was that around the same time he had done that show with Jimmy Kimmel on Comedy Central that I cannot remember? The Man Show.
Yeah, I think it's after The Man Show. But, this is a time I think in Adam Carolla's career where he's thinking he can go the Jimmy Kimmel route and go mainstream, right? So when he does that morning drive show, he's thinking, oh, I'm going to be like Howard Stern light. I'm going to go mainstream. I'm going to do a mainstream drive time show, not a drive time show just for working blue collar men like Howard Stern was doing. And it just didn't work. I mean, it was just boring. The Loveline, Adam Carolla's Loveline experience was, it was hardcore, man. I mean, I don't think Adam Carolla ever held back. I mean, he rightly knew that the only people listening to Loveline were like, well, there weren't that many people listening to Loveline. It wasn't a huge show. So, I mean, it was syndicated, I think, but I mean, it wasn't enormous.
Well, it was Adam and Dr.
Felt comfortable
Drew Pinsky,
talking,
right?
What?
It was him and Dr. Drew Pinsky. That was
another thing. I mean, him and Dr. Drew, Adam Carolla got along with Dr. Drew better than anybody else they ever had on that show, I think. And it was just listening to Dr. Drew and Adam banter. It was legendary. Their banter was legendary on that show.
And Drew would give medical advice like a respected doctor would, and Carolla would humanize it. And then he kind of found a way of getting Drew to kind of get more relaxed too. Carolla comes from improv. He started out the Acme improv group in the early 90s. I remember when I was studying improv, he was in like the first class. You see a photo of him. He had that ability to be really loose and conversational and not a stand-up. He was really an improv guy.
He had wonderful charisma with Drew. And yes, Adam Carolla, the great thing about Adam Carolla, he's kind of like Joe Rogan in this respect. I mean, even though Rogan's also stand-up, but Carolla is never really about stand-up. He's not a stand-up guy, really. I mean, he loves to just talk. He loves to just have a conversation. And Loveline was like the perfect format for him, And when he goes to drive time, he has to like do bits, and he has to be witty, and he has to like do jokes, and he has to be quick. And I mean, it's just didn't work.
So it's very funny that for me, Howard Stern going to terrestrial radio, and for you, Howard Stern going to terrestrial radio really brings the end to what we'll call, in our lifetime, the golden age of radio. And it brings us to the end of this installment. We only went over just a little bit. So stick around. Our next episode will be Growing Old with Radio, where we talk about what it's like, I guess, some almost 20 years later, about 15 years after where we end. We're going to talk about what the landscape is like, both in radio and where we are in our lives and our relationship to radio and to that format of DJs, music, and talk in the modern age. Hope you stick around and come back for that. Thanks, Randall, for all your great stories. That was pretty cool stuff. You got any last words?
Nope. Just watch the next episode. I think it's going to be good.
Watch the next episode. All right. In that case, thank you so much for watching. I'm Chris.
I'm Randall.
And this has been Arts and Entertainment
with Chris and Randall.
Bye.